So the next seam that we're going to make is called a French seam. I use French seams on almost all the clothes that I make that are for myself or for a family member, even for a child, because it just has such a nice, elegant look about it when you go to step inside your garment and it's so clean and crisp looking on the inside. So I'm going to take this same fabric, and when you do a French seam, it's the one time that you're not putting right sides together to start with. You want your wrong sides together. So I've put the back of the fabric together, and this is where my seam is going to be. So we want the final seam to be 5/8. And what's going to happen is we're going to encapsulate the fabric inside of itself. So I'm going to sew a seam here. I'm going to flip my fabric around and I'm going to press it. And then I'm going to sew another seam, and that will capture the raw edge of the fabric inside the seam. So that is why we're going to start sewing on the right side. So both sides of your seam are the right sides of the fabric. And because we want that final seam to be 5/8 of an inch wide, we're going to sew this at 1/4 of an inch. And then when we flip it, we're going to sew it at 3/8. And that will equal 5/8, but you won't see any raw fabric. I think I'd like to get a different piece that isn't crooked. Oh, well, never mind. So let's sew 1/4 of an inch. To sew 1/4 of an inch, if you line up the fabric at the very edge of the presser foot, you cannot see the fabric past it, but you don't want to go too far the other way because then it's going to be too small of a seam. So I've lined it up. I'm going to start sewing, but I am going to do my back tacking, a couple of stitches, and I'm going to stitch this. I'm going to keep it running along the side of that presser foot. This will take some practice. And I'm going to come straight down, and I'm going to have sewn that 1/4 inch seam. So let's back up and back tack that. Let's clean it up. Don't leave any threads hanging. Sometimes the hanging threads get caught on the other side of the seam, and then you're having to clean it up later on. So I've made a little 1/4 inch seam, you can see there. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to the iron, and we're going to press one piece of the fabric over top of the seam like that. And again, you don't want this to be folded back. It needs to be nice and crisp. And on the other side, the fabric should be nice and flat against there. So I'm going to go to the ironing board. So to start with pressing my French seam, I've opened my fabric and I've laid it down. And I want to press the seam one direction or the other. It doesn't really matter. So I'm going to press it over. And then I'm going to check the other side to make sure that I don't have a bump or a roll. So I'm going to smooth this over. I'm going to come at that edge, and I'm going to give a little push and make sure that everything's nice and smooth. Oh, this is that shut-off iron. It shut off on me. Come back on. Okay, it's coming back on, heating up. So then what I want to do is I want to fold my fabric fronts together. So you're going to have the right side together. Let's move down so you can see better. Right sides together. And I'm going to kind of just push on this and try to get the fabric to fold right on where you sewed that seam. So I'm going to check both sides. Again, you want this to be really crisp and nice. And then I'm going to press that flat. I'm pressing it from both sides to make sure it's good. And now we're going to return to the sewing machine and we're going to sew a 3/8 inch seam. So now we're going to sew on the wrong sides. And you can, if you want to just verify, you can open this up and you can see that you have a seam allowance that's on the outside of the garment. That wouldn't look very good. So we're going to sew this at 3/8. So I'm going to put it under the sewing machine. I'm looking for that 3/8 inch line. I think it's like right there. So it's going to be a little bit past that 1/4 inch because what you have encapsulated inside is at a 1/4 inch. So if you sewed a 1/4 inch again, you would see some feathery raw edges of the fabric sticking out. And the 3/8 and a 1/4 inch equals 5/8. So you're going to have the right seam dimension. So So again, I'm going to back tack it, and I'm going to sew that 3/8 inch seam allowance. Back tack it at the other end. Take it out of the machine. I'm going to trim it up, make sure there's no threads hanging. That's a beautiful thing. And then I would go to the sewing machine, and again, I would press this open. For now, I don't care which direction you press it, but when you're making clothing, generally you want that seam, if it's on the sides, you want the seam to point towards the back. If it's in a horizontal position, you would probably want it to, most of the times, be in a downward dimension. So we're going to press this to one side, and then you're going to mark it that it's a French seam, and now you've finished a couple of seam samples. So the first seam, plain seam, has raw edge fabric. French seam has a seam, but it also has what's called an edge finish because the edges of the fabric are encapsulated inside the seam. So it's a really nicely finished seam.